Yeah. So what the technology was initially was just discoveries in intellectual property in the area of sperm epigenetics.
Mhm.
And the reason I was interested in the technology is I had some friends going through fertility treatment.
Yeah.
They'd been trying for 2 years. They spent $80,000 on different treatments, and they were diagnosed with unexplained infertility.
Hmm.
And when I heard that, I was like, that's not a diagnosis.
Yeah.
That's just a label. They don't know what it is, so they're just labeling it
And
unexplained.
were they told at that point nothing could happen, or what was the
Well, they
plan?
were just told we don't know what it is, so let's try this
Oh, okay.
procedure and see. We don't know why you aren't getting pregnant, so let's try artificial insemination. And then when that's not working, let's try the next thing, And so it was just this trial and error medicine, which is often the case when there isn't a good diagnosis. And looking into the workup of patients with
Hmm.
infertility, there was a lot of focus on the female partner. She got extensive and invasive testing and treatment, and her husband had done a standard semen analysis, which is like 1950s technology,
Okay.
using a microscope to
Hmm.
count how many sperm are there and how many are swimming. And
Hmm.
so that was a clear gap in the diagnostic workup on the male side of infertility, and started looking around for where's the emerging technology. And my
Hmm.
background's in molecular diagnostics. So I was like, if they're using microscopy to
Hmm.
count moving sperm, there's got to be some molecular technology that could be applied to this clinical problem.
Hmm.
And came across sperm epigenetics, and it was a connection with someone in the tech transfer office at the University of Utah who
Hmm.
knew that this was an area I was interested in, contacted me and said, "Hey, we've got some technology actually coming back into the university in
Hmm.
sperm epigenetics that you might be interested in. I know you're interested in this infertility space." And
Hmm.
so that's how I found out about the technology. And it was very academic. It was very kind of like foundational, basic science, and a publication that had a patent that had been filed. And so it was in prosecution, and we had the opportunity to license that patent and then start to commercialize it.
Hmm. And was Tim Jenkins an inventor on that? Who was
He
doing the?
was,
Okay.
yeah. So he was in that University of Utah research group in the it was andrology. So I had to learn what's andrology,
Mhm.
and the easy way to explain it is andrology is to men like gynecology is to women.
Oh, I see.
And Tim was in that group along with a couple of other really great researchers,
Hmm.
and had a publication with some IP that had been filed, and we could and I sat down with them
Hmm.
and asked them, what's closest to market? What could we get into the market very quickly to start to validate clinically and see if there's clinical traction? And they said, oh, this sperm age calculator, which
Hmm.
is essentially using epigenetics to calculate the biological age of someone based on their sperm epigenetics
Hmm.
compared to their chronological age. They're like,
Hmm.
this thing is rock solid. Like you could take this to the bank, so to speak. And so that was the first thing that was done, was just putting together a minimally viable offering of
Hmm.
sperm age and testing that in the market to see what kind of traction we could get.
And were there people who immediately wanted to buy it? Or this seems like, it's a medical technology, so there were probably all kinds of approvals you had to go through. What was the path?
Yeah. So the initial path was marketing it as a direct to consumer general health product. So there's no clinical claims associated with it. It was just like, what's your sperm age? Kind of like 23andMe for
Yeah, that
guys
sounds
and
like.
their sperm. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
And it very quickly we did find that there were some men who were super interested in this, and
Hmm.
they wanted to know about it, but it was a niche. It was like these, people who were looking at their everything. They were doing all the
That's
different
the
trackers.
is the
Yeah.
quantified self crowd that just the
Yes,
one thing to track. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And we showed it to some clinicians, and the clinicians were like, well, this is interesting, but I don't know what to do with it. Like, what do I do with this information?
Hmm.
And does it change treatment? And it was very clear, like, if this doesn't change treatment, it's not going to be adopted clinically. So
Right.
it invalidated pretty quickly. And we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, let's get something that is actually a diagnostic identifying male factor infertility that could guide treatment and make a difference in those treatment decisions.
Hmm. Okay. And so today, like, what's the product like right now?
Yeah. So the product today is the first clinically validated epigenetic sperm quality test.
Hmm.
And what this is looking at are the genes in sperm that are most important for that sperm to function, to do its job, which
Uh,
is to find the egg, bind to the egg, penetrate the egg, and fertilize the egg. And it interrogates 1,233 gene promoters for those genes that are most important. And it's multiple cellular pathways.
mhm.
It's the accumulation of dysregulation in those genes that correlates with the clinical phenotype of subfertility in men. And essentially, that just means that the sperm can't do its job. It can't find the egg, bind to the egg, penetrate the egg, and fertilize the egg on its own. And there's a clinical procedure that the physicians can do called intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And it's a long medical term that means that they pick one sperm and they inject it into the egg, doing the job of the sperm for it.
Yeah.
So it guides to that, an abnormal result with sperm
Mhm.
QT guides to that procedure called ICSI, and it's with in vitro fertilization. So they retrieve eggs from the woman, pick a sperm, inject it into the egg, let it develop into an embryo, and then transfer that embryo into the uterus of the female partner.
Okay, so the value of the test is like you're having trouble as a couple getting pregnant, and so the ICSI procedure is probably expensive. You're like, do we do this or not? This test is going to tell us whether it's the only option or whether there may be cheaper alternatives.
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it.
And what's the customer like? Is it I guess doctors are recommending it. What type of doctor does this?
Yeah, it's a fertility doctor, and those are reproductive endocrinologists and infertility specialists. So it's an REI is the acronym for them. And they
Hmm.
are an OB gynecologist who's done an additional 3 years of fellowship training. And
Hmm.
half of that fellowship training of those 3 years is basic research. So they are very data driven and looking for that clinical evidence and that clinical data. And that's what you have to focus on generating that data in order to get adoption with this physician group.
Okay, so the pharma companies, like drug reps, are visiting doctors' offices all day long to make them aware of their drugs. If it's more of a test like this, how do you make the doctors aware?
Yeah, the first thing is presenting the data at industry conferences
Okay.
and getting those platform presentations where this is new innovation in the space. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in male factor infertility diagnostics. So that gets attention, and then presenting that data, the early adopters come to you and they come and say, okay, this is interesting. I want to try this out. And that was the beginning of getting some traction and some adoption from the clinicians.
Okay. And if you're a doctor, if you're one of these early adopters, are you thinking, okay, we'll be more financially efficient because we'll know when to do this test or not? Or where did the interest come from?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's these patients who are going through the fertility journey. There's a high dropout rate. If the fertility treatment isn't working,
Mm-hmm.
65% of patients drop out. They go through some cycles and they're like, I can't do this anymore. The emotional toll is
Yeah.
massive. And so this is the most expensive, as you alluded to. It's the most expensive, the most invasive procedure, this ICSI procedure. So it's the last thing that they typically try.
Uh-huh.
And this is identifying patients right up front that need to do that procedure in order to have success. And they can avoid all of those cycles of failure that caused them to drop out of care. So the physicians were most interested in identifying that subset of patients who need ICSI much earlier in the journey than having to go through that trial and error procedure or that trial and error process
Hmm.
of finding that, oh, ICSI is what's going to work for you to get pregnant. Um, yeah.
If someone saw this clip right now and thought, well, I want to know right now, like I'm the consumer, do they need to go to the doctor to get a test, or do people order it directly from you as well?
They find us and they go directly to our website, pathfertility.com.
Hmm.
It's PATH fertility.com, all one word. And
Okay.
they can order directly on the website. And then we connect them with a male fertility specialist who
Hmm.
can do a telehealth consultation for those patients. If they get an abnormal result, then they want to get into a care pathway and they can work with them through telehealth. And then also they can even come to a certain geographies and do procedures if they need to.
Okay, interesting. And that sounds like kind of the HIMSS model a little bit. Like, is that a trend to have people like go to the provider like that?
Yeah, I think it is more of a trend. The people are really taking control of their healthcare,
Yeah.
and infertility, especially 1 in 6 people experience infertility. It's very common,
Hmm.
and they are very motivated. It's they're looking for answers, and if they're getting unexplained infertility as an answer, that's not very satisfying to patients. And so they're very proactive in looking for solutions and information about why they can't get pregnant.
Yeah, I mean, vague out or poor diagnosis is such a problem for consumers. And Tim Jenkins, it's not just this; he has an Alzheimer's test too. Like that's kind of a thing he's after. So super interesting.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the operation side of this too. So the technological story completely makes sense to me, but along the way, like you're running a startup company, you got to raise money and everything. On the backside, on the business side, what were the challenges? How did things go in the early days?
Yeah, the early days, the biggest expense was intellectual property
Mm,
lawyers and prosecution of the patent applications and getting those granted. And so raising a little bit of money from family and friends to really cover intellectual property attorney fees initially, and then found out early on of sources of non-dilutive capital for these kinds of innovations
hmm.
and went to a SBIR training. So SBIR are Small Business Innovation and Research Grants that are from the federal government and others that you can get funding, non-dilutive funding to move innovations like this closer to commercialization.
Hmm.
And those are challenging, but the training was really helpful and learning how to do those and what are the things that the federal agencies are looking for. We were very fortunate to be successful in getting a phase 1 SBIR grant pretty early on from the NSF, the Natural Science, or the is it, I can't remember what is it, National Science Foundation?
National Science Foundation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So NSF was the first phase 1 we got, and then we were able to get um, a fast track
Hmm.
for from the NIH that is a phase 1 plus a phase 2, which is like 2 million. It was like
Wow.
$2 million in non-dilutive funding,
Hmm.
and that was transformational for us early on, and a huge signal to investors as well that this is legitimate technology, legitimate science that can be commercialized to the you know to the extent that the NIH is funding it, and that
Hmm.
helped us to attract some initial small like seed and VC groups that were interested in putting some money into the company as well.
That's interesting. Yeah. So SBIRs were paused for a few months there. I think they're fully back now. But if
They're
people don't know, there's like hundreds
yeah,
of important companies every year are created this way. So go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. And they're not quite, it's not quite back. It
Uh,
was, yeah, the program, the federal program expired in October,
mhm.
and Congress has been working to get it reauthorized. The House passed it, so the Senate passed it, the House passed it. It's at the president's desk. If he doesn't sign it or veto it, it goes into law, I think, on Wednesday. So the
Okay.
15th of April, it goes into. It
Okay.
goes into law.
Okay.
And then they've got to spin up their whole machinery to then start issuing notices of award. And we're waiting for a notice of award on another grant that we got an incredible score on, um, that's in another area of male infertility.
Hmm.
And we've just been waiting for this. It's a incredible program for startup companies in the life sciences that are doing innovation like this, and it's
Hmm.
really needed. There's thousands of companies that benefit from the SBIR program.
Hmm. Okay, so finance is always a challenge for a startup company, but you've done all kinds of things to make that work. And we have had quite a few life sciences companies kind of bootstrap with non-dilutive funding this way, which is so smart. Operationally, though, like you have to hire, like you're not hiring like low-level blue-collar workers or something like these are going to
Mhm.
be PhDs. How do you staff a startup, which is inherently risky early on?
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple things. So through network connections, and then also the academics who are involved in the innovation. So one thing we did really early on with Tim was asking Tim, who are the best students in
Yeah.
your classes?
Hmm.
And inviting them to come and join as an intern to do an internship, has been really a great source of talent, and paying those interns as well so that they're motivated and incentivized. And just as an example, so one of those interns early on that joined and spent the summer with us was Chad Pollard,
Oh, wow.
who was one of Tim's students and very smart, bright, and capable, and came in and started working with us on our data science projects and identified, some opportunities that then went back and pitched in the business competition at BYU and won that. And then the rest is history, kind of with what's happened with him.
Yeah, and if
So
people don't know Chad, so he founded Renew Biotech, and they've just moved into a new facility this past year in Pleasant Grove. They're killing it, several subsidiaries. And so I do feel like I think students coming out of the labs are a great source. And some of those students are going to go on to be Chad, like to start major ventures of their own. Why not grab them
mhm.
and make them part of your thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And those interns, some of them go back and do a PhD, and so they're in a PhD
Mhm.
program, but they've had that exposure to the commercialization of these kinds of innovations in technology. And some of them choose, like Chad, to go on and start something on their own. Others come back and like, hey, I want to come back and join your company and help you continue to build. So that's a great source. The other is going out to investors and say, look, we want to hire these key positions and we need top tier talent in these roles. And the investors obviously agree with that. They want to see you be successful. And so that's a great story to tell an investor to be able to attract that kind of talent,
Mhm.
and get an investment to help support that.
Mhm. And you've done a lot of interesting things. It feels to me like you've been very strategic about how you've developed not just hiring but other partnerships. How do you think from the start about how this exits eventually, or what the long term is, and what kind of partnerships do you put in place?
Yeah, and to your point, Dave, often those exits are because of a partnership that you've gotten in place, and then it leads to an exit. So one of the key things, strategic decision that we made very early on, is that we weren't going to build a clinical laboratory, that we would contract out that clinical laboratory wet lab process. So
Hmm.
receiving the samples, extracting the DNA from those samples, and analyzing that DNA and doing the raw data, and then uploading that raw data into the cloud where we could do a proprietary analysis.
Hmm.
So those partnerships have been critical in the early days and continue to be. And those are a potential exit because
Hmm.
we're essentially the innovation engine of these assays that are proprietary and unique, and they need those kinds of assays to drive their business. And so that's a natural opportunity. The other places in the ecosystem are, how does this get paid for? So there's payers or benefits providers for employers that are
Hmm.
managing those fertility benefits for their employees. And those are another natural partnership of getting this covered and paid for so the employees don't have to pay out of pocket, or the patients don't have to pay out of pocket for the testing. The other ecosystem players are companies that are selling something that is relevant or adjacent to the diagnostic testing that we're providing. So, pharmaceutical companies that sell drugs for couples that are going through fertility treatment, this is a companion diagnostic, so to speak, that if there's more patients going into an IVF clinical workflow, they're going to utilize more drugs for that IVF workflow. They're also going to utilize more of the medical devices that are used in IVF. And so anything that's adjacent to this diagnostic is another natural partnership.
Mm,
And another strategic decision is, do we build a big commercial team to go out and detail all of these physicians about
mm,
the testing, or partner with an organization that already has a commercial team that's going in there and talking to those doctors? So that's a natural kind of partnership avenue, and generating revenue and in a profit share or a revenue share scenario. Pretty soon the CFO in that company sees what's going on and says, hey, why don't we just get this into our company so that everything is
yeah.
going into the bottom line rather than just this profit share or revenue share?
Okay. Okay. Super interesting. So the on the scale, I kind of think of startups. There's like low opportunity to be easy startups, or there's huge opportunity and hard startups. You're definitely on the huge opportunity, hard opportunity
Yeah.
side. How did you know you could do this?
Yeah. The biggest was talking with physicians early on, and there's the reproductive endocrinologist, and then there's another tier specialist.
Hmm.
That is a reproductive urologist who is board certified in male reproductive health.
Hmm.
And there's only about, at the time, there was about like 200 of these in the United States.
Hmm.
Uh, Reproductive urologists that are specialized in male infertility. And talking with them, it became very clear that there was early on a solution that became the hammer for every nail. And that hammer was ICSI, it was intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And so if there was any situation where sperm couldn't do their job, like, oh, we'll just pick one and inject it into the egg and do the job for it. And so that solved a lot of like of the problem. And early on we talked to doctors like, oh, well, we don't need what you're doing because we have ICSI. We can do ICSI on everyone. And digging into the market opportunity, it became clear that not all physicians are doing ICSI on everyone, and not all patients want to do ICSI. It's the most invasive, it's the most expensive. If they can get pregnant without doing ICSI, they would much prefer that. But if they need ICSI, they would
Yeah.
also like to know that. So the the interviews, the conversations with physicians, with patients going through the journey, and then all of the other staff that are involved. So um, advanced practitioners and nurses, and
Hmm.
all of the people involved in that fertility journey, what they shared with us, it was very clear that there was an opportunity and a gap, and providing them with a better diagnosis of male infertility would be some clinical value that they could utilize in guiding that treatment. And then the next thing was, would patients pay for this? And
Hmm.
so very quickly getting something in, again, partnering with a laboratory so we could stand this up as a lab developed test. We didn't have to get an FDA clearance for it. We can get a CLIA license and work with a CLIA lab. And CLIA is a clinical laboratory. It's regulated by, the CLIA stands for Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. And
Hmm.
it's a federal regulation for clinical laboratories, and they inspect clinical labs every 2 years. We get inspected, and we have a dry lab, and then there's a wet lab that we partnered with. And so it's a distributed model, which was also kind of a strategic decision and a unique way to approach the market and get into the market very quickly.
Hmm.
And so that gave us the ability to get a minimally viable offering as a clinical diagnostic sperm epigenetic analysis to identify if a couple needs ICSI, and for putting that in front of physicians and getting their feedback was when we knew, like, okay, there's something here and it's changing treatment decisions. And once we saw that, we knew that there was something here.
Yeah. So the pain point, super well validated, like clearly compelling. Every adult understands this. And then the other thing is you reduce the capital cost of the model as much as possible. Had to spend on the
Exactly.
patents, you couldn't avoid that, but everything else reduced, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And not over hiring. So one of the things that startups can get in trouble with is prematurely scaling.
mhm,
And so we were very diligent about not prematurely scaling. We wanted to see the market signals. And one of the things that the physicians, our mission is that this becomes standard of care, that it's part of the male workup for everybody going through a fertility journey. And to get standard of care, one clear indication that you've become standard of care is that this becomes part of the clinical guideline.
mhm,
And there's industry organizations that produce these clinical guidelines. And we went to the authors of the clinical guideline and asked them, what's the level of clinical evidence that you need to see in order to consider adding this to the guideline? And they told us. And so
mhm,
we designed a clinical trial with them to generate that level of clinical evidence. And at the same time, we were also getting this into the early adopters, generating clinical evidence with them, and publishing that evidence in peer-reviewed journals that
mhm.
are credible, while we were also doing the clinical trial that the co-authors of the guideline need to see. And so that's the outcome or the mission, is getting this into the clinical guideline. As it becomes standard of care, then OB-gynecologists who are seeing patients first, often seeing them, a female patient, and they're saying, we've been trying to get pregnant
Mhm.
and it hasn't been working. And the doctor says, how long have you been trying? We've been trying for like a year. Like, okay, um, now they can do a test like this to see, should we do artificial insemination or timed intercourse with the OB-gynecologist to help that patient get pregnant, or do they need to get referred to a fertility specialist much quicker and onto a path of getting more extensive treatment because their sperm can't do the job?
Super interesting. Well, I know we're about out of time, but you were doing a lot of things in parallel too. Clearly, again,
Yeah.
very strategic. So super impressive. I
Thank
appreciate you
you.
explaining it to us, Andy. So,
Yeah.
and the website again, pathfertility.com, people could go there right now, right?
Yes.
And then I know you're on LinkedIn. Any other place that people would look for you?
Yeah, we have an Instagram account as well. We're starting to get more active with that. We haven't been huge with social media. We've been focused on generating the clinical evidence. Now
Mhm.
we have that foundational clinical evidence, and so we're becoming much more aggressive in our marketing, because we can back up those clinical claims in a way that isn't going to put us into any kind of hot water, with the regulatory bodies in the government. So.
Yeah.
Instagram, and then we just set up a TikTok account as well. So we're
Yeah.
starting to get more active on social media.
Okay, good. Well, we all know people who have struggled with infertility. So need people to know in their mind that this is an option. So when they have that conversation, they can tell their friend, hey, do you know about this? So,
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dave.
okay, thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.